When you first think of a tank game, what is the first thing that comes to your mind? World of Tanks, War Thunder, Armored Warfare? These three games are arguably the biggest in the market for armored fighting, and they all have a couple things in common. They are all online, have long grinds, and are free to play. Myself and many other people who love this genre have all felt it being increasingly saturated by these predatory monetization policies. However, there is one relatively new game that seeks to offer players of the tank genre a new experience. You know, a game where you can actually play the tank that you want.
GHPC! Identified! Fire heat! On the way! Target!
GHPC is an indie game that focuses on armored warfare in a specific time in history. When you first think of a tank game, I think most people either go towards World War II or the modern day. But GHPC actually takes place in a pretty unique time in history, the 1980s. This time of the world could arguably be considered the height of the Cold War, and evidently, the game takes place in Fulda Gap, a region of Germany where NATO thought a Soviet invasion was most likely. GHPC at the time of recording is still in early access, but that doesn't mean there is no content. Booting up the game, you are greeted with two modes, Instant Action and Campaign. We will come back to Campaign later. Instant Action is currently just a series of scenarios and short missions that take place in 4 areas in Fulda Gap. Throughout these missions, you can take control of 3 factions, the United States Army, the National People's Army, and the Red Army. And although this might seem like an unbalanced fight, the scenarios are all designed in a way so that it's as even as possible. When you load into a mission, you start out in your tank, and maybe a few other ones in your battalion. From there, you proceed with your mission, and as you fight enemies, your commander will point out tanks for you with the location, what type of tank it is, and what kind of ammo to use against it. For me personally, this feature was very useful, as for my experiences in War Thunder, I hated dying to enemies who I had no idea where they were. And don't worry, if you do end up dying, which you most likely will if you knew, you can switch and take over other friendly tanks to continue playing. If you ever find yourself in a tricky spot in GHPC, opening your map will give you a list of fire support teams that you can call in depending on the mission. These can range from smoke to artillery and even close air support. It should be noted that unlike more arcadey games that I mentioned earlier, there is also no repairing or recruiting your tank during the mission. If you get shot in the breach and can't shoot anymore, that tank is basically dead.
Gunner, missile, tank, reverse left, on. Identified! On the way! Target, cease tracking.
Much like War Thunder, GHPC also has a post-action mode, where you can see each individual shot that was fired throughout the mission, as well as how they damage each of the tank's components. Aside from all that, GHPC also boasts a wide range of vehicles for each nation that you can take control of, from MBTs to IFEs, and even stuff like dismounted tows and trucks. So let's go ahead and go through all the main armored fighting vehicles that you can play as. The M60A1 is the oldest American MBT that you can find in GHPC. Developed in 1960 in an attempt to modernize the normal M60, the M60A1 improves a lot on the shortcomings that the original model had, adding a new turret design, a searchlight above the barrel, and adding an optical rangefinder. The M60A1 Rise Passive was one of the last modifications for the M60A1, as it added a stabilizer, limited night vision, and a new smoke screen, as well as the ability to add ERA, which isn't seen in GHPC. Assuming GHPC takes place in the 80s, this tank is about 20 years old by the time you're playing, meaning it's way past its prime. Its lack of mobility, proper thermals or night vision, and lack of laser rangefinder means that this tank is outclassed by pretty much everything newer than a T-55. As far as armor goes, the M60 in general is quite lacking, as most Russian rounds better than 3BM20 should be able to go right through you, and overall you will be rarely bouncing shots while playing the M60A1. M833 is a pretty good round for the M60, as it is the default American one in GHPC. Just make sure you don't mess up your shots, and you should be good. The M60A3 TTS was one of the last upgrades in the M60 family, being developed in the mid-1970s and put into service in the early 1980s. In GHPC, the M60A3 TTS improves on just about all of the shortcomings of the M60A1, having a fully digital fire control system complete with thermals and a laser rangefinder. These upgrades make the tank significantly better to use and completely makes the older M60s obsolete. However, there are still two main issues that are carried over from the M60A1, being armor and mobility. The M60A3 TTS still has a terrible top speed and horsepower compared to other tanks, and its armor is still very weak. Although some of these issues still plague the TTS, it is still a massive overall upgrade and improvement to the M60A1. Also, as a bit of a side note, something I noticed while playing the TTS that I didn't notice on the M60A1 was how shaky and unstable the gun is. You can see that it really likes to jitter around with the slightest movement. And I don't know if this was historically accurate, but it should be something kept in mind when playing. The M1 Abrams is the best American MBT in GHPC, and I would even argue it is the best MBT in the game altogether. Developed in the 1970s in an attempt to replace the ever-aging M60s, the M1 Abrams would be officially put into service in February of 1980 in the US Army, being one of the latest MBTs featured in the game. In GHPC, the Abrams is the jack of all trades. It has a fully digital fire control system with thermals and a laser rangefinder, meaning it's great for long-range sniping. For close combat brawling, the M1's armor is leagues above the M60, meaning most Russian shells should not be able to pen you frontally. Just keep a lookout for the sights in the back of the vehicle, as those are where the weak spots are. Aside from armor, the Abrams improves on the other weaknesses of the M60, being extremely mobile. The M1 practically flies across the battlefield with its high front and reverse speeds, meaning unlike its Russian counterparts, it's able to pop smoke and quickly disengage from combat if need be. The M1 also fixed the shaky gun sight from the M60A3, as it feels extremely smooth to use. Overall, the M1 Abrams, I'd argue, is one of, if not the best MBT in GHPC. The M2 Bradley is the main IFV used by American forces in GHPC, having good armament but poor survivability. Developed in the late 70s and put into service in 1981, the Bradley was the US's main response to the Russian BMPs that have been developed. In GHPC, the M2 is more of a RAV vehicle and shouldn't be used to Russian enemy force head-on. Its primary 25mm autocannon is good enough to deal with most APCs and BMPs that you come across, but keep in mind that you only have 70 rounds of AP to use. For more armored targets, the BGM-71C ITOs should be good enough, as any decent shot to a Soviet tank should instantly ammo rack it.
Eddie, on the way. Tracking. Tracking. Target. He's tracking.
As far as mobility goes, it's leagues above the M60, but still not as good as the Abrams. And lastly, the survivability of the M2 Bradley is quite poor. While it can sometimes bounce an unlucky shot by an enemy, most HE and AP rounds will kill you instantly.
Hey! Traverse right on!
Overall, the M2 Bradley is a good tank for its role. If you treat this thing like an MBT, you will most likely die. And until infantry gets added to the game, the M2 won't be able to fulfill one of its main roles. For now though, if you want to go tank hunting, flanking is always a good choice for the Sci-Fi.
Identify tank! Run away! Target! He's targeting!
The T-55 is a Soviet MBT that was developed in 1956 from older Russian tanks like the T-54 and T-44. The T-55A was an upgrade to the regular T-55, adding more armor and replacing the Coax MG. From 1964 to 1983, around 2,700 Czech T-55As were produced under license from the Soviets, and in the same year, 1964, East Germany would order around 1,700 T-55As from Czechoslovakia, which is the version that we see in GHPC. In-game, the East German T-55A is an ancient vehicle, being around 30 years old by the 1980s. The armor and survivability of this tank is subsequently very poor, as M833 will almost always one-shot you. 3BM20 is also an okay round, being good against M60s that you come across. However, there are still two massive issues with the T-55A, a lack of laser rangefinder and thermals. Much like the M60A1, lacking these two necessities makes the T-55A completely obsolete by newer standards. And overall, the East German T-55A is an alright tank. It has an okay round, decent armor, and generally a poor survivability. All of these problems are made 100% worse when you realize that this thing is going to be going up against Bradleys, M60s, and M1 Abrams. The T-72 is a Soviet tank that was developed from the T-62 and the T-64, entering service in 1971. The T-72M1 was the export variant of the T-72A that was licensed to many Warsaw Pact countries, like Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and East Germany. The East German T-72M1 is the version that we see in GHPC, and it basically improves on all the shortcomings of the older T-55A, adding more armor, a laser rangefinder, and an autoloader. These new additions make the 72M1 so much better to play, but it does still have some problems. For one, it's still missing thermals, which makes this tank an absolute pain to play at night. And just like the T-55A, this thing has no reverse speed whatsoever, so good luck getting out of a tricky situation. And lastly, I'm not sure which round is better, but it seems that the T-72M1 actually gets 3BM15, while the 55A gets 3BM20. I'm not sure what's the difference between these two rounds, but it does seem that 3BM15 performs better from my experience. Overall, the T-72M1 is the main MBT used by East German forces, and for what it is, it's an alright tank. You can easily beat M60s and any older MBT that you come across, but just be sure to watch out for your weak spots. The BMP-1 could widely be considered the first troop carrier IFV. It was developed by the Soviets and put into service in 1966. And while it is a revolutionary IFV, in GHPC, it's kind of a different story. Like many other older East German tanks, the BMP-1 is ancient and completely obsolete. It lacks any laser rangefinder, thermals, or even a stabilizer. The main gun only fires HE rounds, so it's damn near useless against anything other than light tanks. The ATGM is even worse. The Malyutka fires in such an odd way that it's nearly impossible to hit any target. This entire loadout is just so bad that I failed to get any meaningful kills on it, other than M113s. Overall, the BMP-1, while good for its time, is probably the most outdated IFV that you'll ever see in GHPC. Just avoid this thing altogether and save your sanity. The T-62 is a bit of an interesting vehicle in GHPC. It was put into service in 1961 in an attempt to replace the aging Soviet fleet of T-55s. In-game, however, the T-62 sees little improvement over its older counterparts. For one, it still lacks any sort of thermals or laser rangefinder, meaning in a long-range battle, you will most likely get smoked. Furthermore, the chassis of the T-62 is built off of the T-55, so you have poor armor and survivability. And as far as mobility goes, the T-62 is alright, but like all Russian tanks, there is no reverse speed to speak of. Now, before you think I'm going to spend this entire segment shitting on the T-62, this thing does have one really good benefit. The round that it gets, being 3BM28, is really good, as it will pretty much always destroy M60s. So, overall, just treat the T-62 like a glass cannon, and you should be good. The T-64 is a Soviet tank that was developed in the early 1960s and was made to modernize the T-62. In-game, the main thing the T-64A improves on is armor, as it gets a brand new chassis, meaning it's able to bounce a lot more rounds. Furthermore, the 64A gets access to the most powerful Russian round in the game, being 3BM32, and to this day, this is the most effective round to fight against M1 Abrams. The T-64A still carries many issues from the other Soviet tanks though. It lacks any thermals, only having access to night vision. And while it does get an optical rangefinder like the M60A1, it's still nowhere near good enough as the full laser rangefinder that most of your enemies will have. So basically, the T-64A is a close combat brawler. If you use your armor effectively and don't get into a sniping battle, the tank performs well. The T-80 is a Soviet-made tank that was put into service in the late 1970s. In GHPC, the T-80B is the most advanced main battle tank used by Russian forces. By far the biggest upgrade it gets is having access to a fully digital fire control system and a laser rangefinder. And along with having good armor, the T-80B also gets access to 3BM32, which makes this tank really effective against M1 Abrams. However, there are still a few problems with this tank. For one, it still doesn't have any thermals, having only night vision, and the reverse speed on the T-80, like all other Russian tanks, is very poor. But overall, the T-80B is a really good tank and is very fun to play. The BMP-2 was the primary upgrade made by the Soviets to replace the aging BMP-1, improving on just about all of its shortcomings. In-game, the BMP-2 is the main IFV used by Russian forces, and yes, it is a million times better than the BMP-1. For one, the main gun which fired potatoes has been replaced by an autocannon, and while it is pretty ineffective against tanks, this thing will absolutely shred through M2 Bradleys and M113s. The ATGM has also been upgraded, as the new Konkurs is a lot better with dealing with tanks. The only problem is that unlike the autocannon which is stabilized, the Konkurs isn't, meaning that you have to wait a couple seconds for it to level out before firing. And it's annoying as it's gotten me killed many times. But other than that, the BMP-2 across the board is a breath of fresh air for Soviet IFVs. Now, I was kind of putting off talking about the campaign, since it's probably going to get changed in the 1.0 release. In its current state, however, the campaign mode builds off of the normal instant action mode. Loading in, you can either choose to play as NATO or the Warsaw Pact, and at the top of the screen, you can see that there are arrows next to Folder Gap. Perhaps this could be referring to future theaters? Selecting your faction, you are put into a large map of Folder Gap, with the only currently playable area being Fulda. However, the cities of Erfurt and even Frankfurt are on the map, so they might become playable in the future. And finally, going into the selected area, you can see a couple of scenarios that you can choose from. Winning one of these games will deplete the enemy's health bar at the top of the screen, while losing will deplete your health bar. So overall, the campaign mode is still very much work in progress, and a lot of stuff that I just talked about will most likely get changed in the future. While I had a really good time playing GHPC, there were a couple problems that started to arise the more I played. There are currently only 4 variants of the Folder Gap area in-game, and these get stale really fast. The more I play, the more these maps just blend into one. I would have liked to have seen more diverse map designs, and some scenarios that take place in some of the towns we see, because as you know, I'm a big fan of urban maps. Secondly, while the content of GHPC is vast, the replayability is quite poor. Once you've played a couple scenarios in instant action and dipped your toes in the campaign, you realize that the game is currently just a bunch of small scenarios, which while can be good, also gets boring fast. And lastly, I also heard a lot of people complaining that the AI controlling the tanks can play unfair and always know where the player is coming from, but from my experience, that is not something that happened to me. So overall, the problems for GHPC are quite minimal, and mostly can be fixed through updates and patches. I was also really surprised, as I pretty much didn't have any experience with bugs or glitches when I was playing. So going into the future, I think most of these problems will be addressed. Speaking of the future though, GHPC is still an early access game, which still means that there is a lot more to come. And we can get a sneak peek at what these features are going to be by going to the official GHPC website and looking at their roadmap. Now, this image is 2 years old, meaning some of these things like basic campaign, fire support, and the Soviets are already in the game, but there are still lots to look forward to. Going to the top, there is infantry. This addition would be huge for the game, as it would revamp the gameplay altogether, making it more like squad and armor. Next up is detailed crew. Currently, the only crew we can see in the game is for vehicles like the M113 and the tow launcher, so adding crew with the addition of infantry would be really cool to see. Another feature which I think a lot of you guys were curious about is West German forces in GHPC. This would be a really nice addition to the game, and could even pave way for more NATO forces like the British or the French. I'm also guessing that the Bundeswehr has got some progress put into it, as there is already a Leopard 1 model in game. Next we have Enhanced Destruction, and I'm not too sure how this is going to work when it gets added, so I'm curious to see if this is either going to be a visual upgrade or like redoing all the models to be soft body for instance. And next up is Extended Campaign. Once again, I'm not too sure what the devs mean by this, but I'm definitely looking forward to whatever they have planned. And yes, finally, the feature that I'm sure everyone wants, multiplayer. It goes without saying that this feature alone would be massive to the game, as pretty much everyone will play GHPC just for the multiplayer. So, overall, GHPC does have quite a bit of content planned for the future, and I should also mention that I'm pretty sure these features are not confirmed, so take everything you see here with a grain of salt. What the indie devs managed to do with GHPC is seriously impressive, and although the game in its current format does have some problems with it, I feel like it has some serious potential as more updates come out. If you want to check out the Steam page, I've linked it in the description, so feel free to check it out. But anyway guys, thanks so much for watching. Subscribe if you've enjoyed, and I will catch you guys in the next one.